when we look at the most involuntary medical experiments conducted on people in the United States and throughout the world, first they target people of color, poor people, women, children, prisoners, indigenous people. And if you don't believe me because you never heard it in the news, let's go to the news, because they had to fess up because they got busted. And we're going to do that now before we get into the full of this, because you are going to be amazed and utterly dumbfounded about things you've never heard about in the news, because the people that are doing these experiments are controlling the media also. And therefore, it is not the narrative that the talking heads are going to put forward, but you need to listen to it.
Next story is so unbelievable we didn't think it could possibly be true. But after receiving thousands of records and declassified reports from the Army, it's confirmed that during the Cold War, the United States military conducted secret tests on unsuspecting people in the city of St. Louis. A local sociologist will make her findings public tomorrow, but she spoke first to the I-Team's Lisa Zigman.
Lisa Martino-Taylor's life work has been to uncover details of the Army's ultra-secret military experiments carried out in St. Louis and other cities during the 1950s and 60s.
This study was secretive for a reason. They didn't have volunteers stepping up and saying, yeah, I'll breathe zinc cadmium sulfide with radioactive particles.
These Army archive pictures show how the tests were done in Corpus Christi, Texas in the 1960s. In Texas, planes were used to drop the chemical, but in St. Louis, the Army placed chemical sprayers on buildings and station wagons. City officials were kept in the dark about the tests. The Cold War cover story was that the Army was testing smoke screens to protect cities from a Russian attack. The truth, according to Martino-Taylor, was much more sinister.
It's pretty shocking. The level of duplicity and secrecy, clearly they went to great lengths to deceive people.
By making hundreds of Freedom of Information Act requests, she uncovered once classified documents that confirmed the spraying of zinc cadmium sulfide. The greatest concentration of this compound was sprayed near the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex just south of downtown St. Louis. It was home to 10,000 low-income people, and an estimated 70% were under the age of 12. Martino-Taylor claims they all unknowingly inhaled this compound morning, noon, and night so the government could measure its effects on their lungs.
So this is in violation of all medical ethics, all international codes, and the military's own policy at that time.
In 1994, then Congressman Richard Gephardt asked the Army to open its records and explain the St. Louis testing.
We want to make very sure that nothing went on that would harm anyone and that all the facts are out on the table.
Documents released in the 90s show the Army placed sprayers on this former Knights of Columbus building on Lindell and in Forest Park. The Army always insisted the chemical compound was safe. Martino-Taylor believes documents prove otherwise.
There's a lot of evidence that indicates that people in St. Louis, in the city, particularly in minority communities, were subjected to military tests that was connected to a larger radiological weapons development and testing project.
For the first time, she links the St. Louis testing to a company called U.S. Radium, a company notorious for lawsuits involving radioactive contamination of its workers.
United States Radium had this reputation where they had been found legally liable decades prior for producing a radioactive powdered paint that killed many young women who painted fluorescent watch dials.
While the Army admits it added a fluorescent substance to the zinc-cadmium compound, details of whether it was radioactive remain secret. Documents uncovered to date indicate the Army never conducted follow-up studies to see whether the compound caused long-term health issues. In 1972, after years of crime, poverty, and decline, the government destroyed the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex.
I hope I've got your attention, and if you are a part or a member of Black Lives Matter, this is what you should be protesting. and you'd be doing it for all mankind, because there is no black and white. There is man, there is woman. We are one, and your skin coloring has nothing to do with love. What color is love? Let me make that clear. The color of love is clear, and it also builds your immune system. Love builds your immune system. Love your neighbor, love your friends, and love your enemies. So let's move on, and let's take a look at what doctors and science that are there to benefit the human society have been doing, are doing, and will continue to do in the future. Many of you may be saying, well, they would never spray anything on us now. Let's go back to 2016 and listen to the director of the CIA real quick. His name is John Brennan.
Another example is the array of technologies, often referred to collectively as geoengineering, that potentially could help reverse the warming effects of global climate change. One that has gained my personal attention is stratospheric aerosol injection, or SAI, a method of seeding the stratosphere with particles that can help reflect the sun's heat in much the same way that volcanic eruptions do.
Well, isn't that lovely? Another upper atmospheric aerosol injection program. And what he fails to put forward is that these are nanoparticles of aluminum and barium. And aluminum is associated with Alzheimer's. Those that intake a large amount of aluminum, the aluminum finds its way to the brain, and you will find, if you do a study, that aluminum in the human system causes Alzheimer's. Now we've got fluoride in the water, we got genetically modified organisms in our foods, GMOs, and we have what is called the bovine growth hormone in our milk and butter. It is mandatory. If you want to be in the World Trade Organization, you've got to adhere to their guidelines when it comes to food. Now, I did a video about Codex Alimentarius. You need to listen to that. I'll put a link to it down in the description. There's a Dr. Rima Libo that came out warning people about what Codex Alimentarius was all about, that was going to be implemented in 2009 and is there now. That's why you see the huge increase in GMOs globally. But let's move forward as we look back on documented involuntary medical experiments perpetrated against unwitting suspects. And we're going to look back and we're going to see the atrocities that science and doctors have done in the past. Now, if you go in and you get tested for COVID, what happens is, boom, they get $13,000 if you test positive for COVID. If they put you on a respirator, they get $37,000 for every person they put on a respirator. But let's take a look back in history of what has happened. And I'm going to put a link to this video of which I'm getting this from. It's called Human Guinea Pigs, Involuntary Medical Experimentation, A Global Perspective. But we're going to include the ones that America was involved in. And it is going to shock and amaze you of what American scientists and doctors involve themselves in. And they always put it down. It is for the betterment of humanity, that few should suffer for the many, which is not right at all. And you know that in your heart.
To highlight some of the things that our Army did, which is something that as an American citizen, I absolutely don't want to believe. The Army, not only on soldiers, which I don't really get into in this presentation because that is such a big subject, but on prisoners, would go to different prisons and, you know, it was just an open subject field. This one particular one at Stateville Penitentiary in Chicago, which was co-sponsored by the U.S. Army, they infected 400 prisoners with malaria 1940s. This is during World War II. And they said this is to help American soldiers fighting in, malaria-ridden countries, Philippines, etc. During the Nazi doctor's trial after the war, in the late 1940s, the Nazis' doctors, in their defense, said, look, Chicago, Americans were doing this. We were doing just the same thing. We did exactly the same thing. The experiments that we were doing at Auschwitz and at the other camps, we were doing it to help the German war effort. So why are you prosecuting us? You did the same thing on your own people. And they're right. Just to show you that no age was really safe, even experiments on babies. And of course, people with mental disabilities were also a prime subject area. They had absolutely no rights, very little voice. Most of them, even if it was explained to them or they read what was going to be done to them, depending on their intellectual ability, had no idea what was happening. So it really wasn't informed consent. And these people were locked in freezers for 120 hours. 120 hours just to see what cold would do to people with mental disabilities. Some of the most infamous experiments that have happened in our history were during the Holocaust, conducted by Nazi doctors. This is one such experimental room. In all, they did about 180 different types of experiments in different camps. The low number is 7,000 people were experimented upon, mainly Jews, but also Roma. Roma is the appropriate name for gypsies. And then you can also see babies, twins, women, and dwarfs. And the people conducting these experiments, quote, were doctors, extremely educated, experienced doctors from very prestigious German and Austrian universities, just like the doctors from Harvard, from the Rockefeller Institute, etc. The Nazi medical experiments you can kind of set into two different types of groups, one for the military and one just to further their political ideology, their superiority ideology, Aryanism, that only tall, blonde, blue-eyed people had a right to live if you were of Nordic race. And so it was very different, the types of experiments that they committed. And you can see, and these are all of these experiments that they were doing for their military, we also did, for the same reasons. The eugenics was also happening in this country also. Sterilization, castration, etc. Sometimes in a different form. That's one of the needles that they used. Dachau was one of the camps where they did a lot of the military experiments. High pressure experiments, ice water, so if their pilots got shot down, how long could they stay alive, etc. And here again, just like with the Japanese Army, they're taking pictures of conducting, in the process of conducting these experiments which end up killing people. Ravensbrück was a camp in northern Germany, mainly for women. And so most of the prisoners there and most of the people experimented upon were women, and like other people, like the Chinese were referred to as logs, these women were referred to as rabbits. This is a group of women that survived the experiments. Has anyone heard of Project Paperclip? Project Paperclip? Project Paperclip, 1945, the end of the war. The Americans, there's this myth that America, and I'll speak just about America right now because we live in America, and was one of the primary countries involved in the war and after the war. America knew what was happening during the Holocaust. At all times, they knew. The myth of the government not knowing is just simply not true. So they knew what was happening with the Nazis trying to build atomic weaponry, and they knew about the experiments, they knew the gas chambers, they knew what was happening. So at the end of the war, before the actual surrender, before the actual end, what they did is go in and recruit all of these Nazis, Nazi scientists, Nazi doctors. They brought them to America, gave them really nice lives, anything they wanted, with the condition that they worked on our atomic program, our space program. It was Nazi scientists who helped launch the Apollos, and also the germ and biological warfare, because they had done so many gassings. They were experts in gas and other chemicals, and also experimentation. So we imported this group of Nazis to the United States to work in our military and our medical profession. And it was referred to as, it was a secret operation referred to as Project Paperclip. And this is what I mentioned before. In 1946 is when US and Japan, they transferred the Unit 731, all that data, to America and gave them immunity. What has our government done? I mean, I don't, I can theorize, but just to put the question out there, what has our government done with all of this data and information and research from the Japanese army, from the Nazis, what they did in Puerto Rico? What is all of this being used for? Something to think about. What have they done with this research? Even experimenting on veterans in Veterans Administration hospitals. They even had, a file was found where in 1946 they were even saying, this is an order, it's top secret, classified, but when you are experimenting upon veterans in the VA hospitals, do not use the word experiment, because that's a loaded term, that's a red flag for people. We don't want anyone to think we're experimenting on our own soldiers, on our own veterans. Use the terms investigations or observations. Guatemala is also another very infamous case. Has anyone heard about the Guatemalan research back in the 1940s? These were against Guatemalan soldiers, prisoners in their state penitentiary, a lot of people with disabilities, and women, a lot of women. They infected them with different types of venereal diseases, and what they did, and you can see this quote right here, which is really something else, and if you ever wonder where your taxpayer money might be going today, and for taxpayers during the 1940s, where it went, they were purchasing women to go into the prisons in Guatemala, infect the prisoners so that they could do experiments on the women and on the men. And if the women didn't have any VD, then they gave it to them. And they did it really horrifically and painfully, as you can see, and very sadistically. The medical team in Guatemala, and one of the reasons I bring it up to you, the medical team in Guatemala that they were doing this on with syphilis, gonorrhea, look at right here. It was led by Dr. Cutler. Dr. Cutler was one of the physicians in the Tuskegee experiments. That is not a coincidence. That is absolutely not a coincidence. He was successful in Tuskegee, and so, of course, they're using him here also. And this is during the same time period as Tuskegee experiments are still going on. Those didn't end until 72, don't forget. With Guatemala, and I have a slide on it later, but in Guatemala, Guatemalans recently have brought suit and have tried to sue to get some type of recognition and reparation for what was done to them. And you'll see what's very interesting about how that was handled by our government. These are just different types of different experiments. You can see one that I want to point out that is Maybe because I lived near San Francisco, so this one affected me more than some of the other ones. From the 1950 to 1969, San Francisco, and this wasn't limited to San Francisco, it ended up happening coast to coast. The Navy, in trying some of their biological warfare to see if the Navy put a ship off the coast of a country and wanted to infect a population, the enemy, how much toxins did they have to use? How far away would a ship have to be from the coast? How big an area could they cover? So they needed to experiment. So where did they experiment? In San Francisco Bay. In San Francisco Bay on residents living in San Francisco. And these were called mock biological warfare attacks. Has anyone been to San Francisco? It's a beautiful city. Okay, now, if that, one of the prisons that, unfortunately, the prisoners of there for so many decades, you can see 52 to 80, so many decades of abuse of prisoners was in Holmesburg prison. And here's just one photo from one of the experiments. And he is a medical administrator. 33 drug companies tested 153 drugs on the prisoners there. And one of the other things to keep in mind throughout all of these different case studies that I've been giving you is that if the people survived from what was done to them, if they survived, they were left scarred many times. They were left in pain. They had physical disabilities. They might have incurred other diseases later on in life, other cancers, maybe multiple sclerosis, different types of diseases. And in many cases, they then passed it on to their children, which is something that hasn't fully been studied yet because of what they were infected with. Anyone live in Staten Island? Go to Staten Island? Anyone familiar with the Willowbrook State School? Right here, Staten Island, our next door neighbor. There was a school there for people with mental disabilities, and they did horrific experiments there. And this was a state-funded school. These kids, and this is a photo of children at the school, this is how they were treated, and this is one of the better pictures. They were basically just left on their own, but there was a lot of other abuses that were going on. They were forced to drink milkshakes that had hepatitis in them. Now, their parents knew what was happening to them because the only way these kids could be put into this school is if the parents or the guardians gave permission. The parents were told, if you don't allow your child to participate in these studies, they will not be accepted into the school. And the doctor here who supervised, Dr. Saul Krugman, really believed that he was serving mankind, helping to find a cure for hepatitis at the cost of the lives, the mental and physical well-being of these children. All right, if nothing else got to you, then this one should. I just want you to take a look at what happened in the 60s. The same thing that happened in San Francisco, which they did in many other places in the country, if not with naval ships, then they released toxins, maybe flying over and dropping it from the sky. They released toxins in the New York subway system. What are you thinking about? I mean, you're a very quiet group. I know I am throwing an enormous amount of really difficult, horrible, painful information at you. I do understand that. But I'd really like to know what you're thinking, what you're feeling at this point. Any thoughts, any comments? Yes, please. I don't agree. Absolutely. Anyone just want to vent? Anyone want to say anything? I mean, it's really, It's easy to disassociate or to separate yourself when you're hearing about these things happening to other people, even the Tuskegee experiments, Guatemala, Puerto Rico, the Holocaust. You know, it doesn't touch you. But when you see that it's happening in the New York subway system, because we live here, and I'm sure that most of you have been on the subway system, I have, you know, it'll affect you a different way. So I just want to give you the space to get anything off your mind that you want to. Yes, please.
I feel their pain. Like, I actually do feel their pain. It hurts.
Yeah, it does. Even though these were secret experiments, and what happened in San Francisco, some of the files, some have been declassified over the years, some haven't been, but doctors in the area, like in the San Francisco Bay Area, the New York area, after a certain amount of time, all of a sudden, doctors were seeing a massive increase in patients exhibiting the same symptoms. Some immediately because of the toxins, others over a certain amount of time. Things that people just normally didn't experience, especially not in mass numbers. So that started to really alert the medical community. Because this wasn't, you know, it's not like they called up local doctors and said, by the way, on Tuesday, we're going to be spraying the subway system, so expect an increase at the hospitals and in your, you know, your practice. Oh, just also want to point out the Helsinki Declaration. We've heard, you know, the Berlin, we've heard over the decades, different people are coming forward saying, no, you must have informed consent, you can't be doing this on human beings, etc. Again, with Helsinki, very famous, you know, people come first, individual rights come first. This was in '64. Obviously, it doesn't mean anything to the CIA and the Army. Mexican American women were uninformed, purposefully uninformed about tests that were being done at different birth control centers that they were going to. In San Antonio, Texas, they believed they were getting birth control pills when in fact they were just placebos. So here they are going thinking they're going to get something to prevent pregnancy, and it doesn't happen. They were used as guinea pigs for pharmaceutical companies. And there was massive protest by the women once this came to, once they realized what was happening. Even though the Tuskegee experiments began decades earlier, a final report was finally released in the 70s. And again, National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects. You know, there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of money spent on these reports, on these commissions, but in reality, the practice hasn't changed. And there's certain groups that have really been targeted. You know, I gave that list, you know, prisoners we've seen over and over again. But poor women and women of color, these were some of the protests in San Antonio from the women that were, there were also some sterilization experiments that went on there. This is in protest, making the point, just like up here, that involuntary medical research, especially forced sterilization on a group of people, like poor women, like black women, like Mexican American women, this is in direct violation to the United Nations Genocide Convention, which states it's a crime against humanity if you take measures intended to prevent the births within a specific group. That is part of the Genocide Convention, in direct violation. These are some more examples and what was done on some poor women receiving Medicaid, Native Americans. Over the years, so many involuntary sterilizations, so many birth control types of experiments. And these were performed when you think, how could somebody be sterilized without knowing it? They would go in for regular medical checkup or gynecological checkup or some other type of surgery, and this would be done to them without their even knowing it. Puerto Rican women, not only were they being sterilized en masse in Puerto Rico, but also in the United States. And you can see some of the statistics, which is so far magnified by white women in the United States. FDA prohibits prisoner use for medical experiments. Short and simple and sweet, clear as a bell, 1980. Obviously, it still doesn't stop that from happening. Supreme Court, when a soldier sued the Army because they were tested with LSD without their consent, without their knowledge, the Supreme Court said you cannot sue the Army for that. The Army is exempt. All military is exempt, the government's exempt, CIA is exempt. Certain groups are exempt, and these are the same groups that are sponsoring it. And here, the Nuremberg Code, which came out after the Holocaust, that basically is saying the same thing, was waived for the Department of Defense. So the question is about justice, and if it's even possible. Basically, this is talking about how it is absolutely horrific to use people in psychiatric institutions for experimentation. And this particular justice is comparing it to what the Nazis did. I wanted to put this up because this reminded me of Henrietta Lacks and the cells and all the different pictures of her cells. They were really quite beautiful. These are brain scans of children that were taken during research right here in New York with Columbia University, Queens, Mount Sinai School of Medicine on very, very young kids, Black and Hispanic boys between the ages of 6 to 10, and what they did to these kids. And look at the year. This is just yesterday, 1996. This is not 1930, 1920, 1940, 1996. Right here in New York City by Columbia, Mount Sinai. They injected the kids with certain chemicals because they wanted to prove that these kids would grow up to be criminals. And they could tell that by looking at their brain scans and how the chemicals reacted with their brains. Finally, in '97, there's an official recognition and apology by the President of the United States, and this is one of the survivors of the Tuskegee experiments. Across the country in Nigeria, Pfizer, a huge pharmaceutical company, pays the Nigerian government $75 million, not because they did anything wrong with experiments there, but just because they want to help out the Nigerian government. This is one of the boys who was injected with meningitis and had brain damage for the rest of his life. For the rest of his life. Different reports and commissions have come out. This is specifically about Guatemala. And again, official recognition and apology to Guatemalan's president. And, politically, I'm a supporter of Hillary Clinton. And yet, I want to say to her, why are you apologizing to the president today? You need to look up if there's any victims or there's families from those experiments and apologize to them and compensate them somehow. For the sake of time, if we have more time and if you're interested, I have a very short clip. It's about 3 minutes on Guatemala and the experiments down there. But let me just get to the end. 2012, literally yesterday, U.S. District Judge officially, legally admits that those experiments were absolutely horrific, what they did to Guatemala. But the Guatemalan study is troubling, blah, blah, blah. This court is powerless to provide any redress to the plaintiffs. The Guatemalans sued the government. Their pleas are more appropriately directed to the political branches of our government, who, if they choose, have the ability to grant some type of relief of those affected in the Guatemalan study. What does that say to you? I mean, how do you interpret that? How do you feel about that? This just happened, 2012. They're saying we can't do anything about it. Maybe our government will. It's a political issue. It's not human rights. It's not medical. It has nothing to do with all the different commission and reports you saw up on the slides, the different Helsinki, the Nuremberg Code. They're just throwing all of that away and saying, we can't deal with this for political reasons. It's just mind-boggling. And it got a lot of coverage. I don't know how much, if you notice, I mean, CNN was covering it. Times was covering it. In the past decades, the United States has passed over 1,000 different types of regulations. I've only shown you a few of them, just a few. But there's so many problems with that. One is that who's enforcing them? Nobody. Who's even reviewing them? Nobody. Who's exempt? Almost everybody. So this is going on, and I warned you at the very beginning, this is not going to end well, this presentation. It's depressing, it's scary. Nothing has been done. We are, we don't know. You're going to a New York library to do some research. How do you know that day they're not releasing toxins into the subway system? How do you know that? You don't know. And you have no legal rights. And it might affect your children, your future. And so the question is, what's happening today? What's going to happen tomorrow? One of the new targets has to do with the Genome Project and genome research and DNA. And if any of the biologists want to jump in, they're really targeting indigenous women, women who come from matrilineal societies where the family, the ancestry is traced through the mother, because it's a much clearer, direct line than when you go patrilineal with the father, because then it can branch off all different ways. But with the mother, it's a more direct line. So these women, indigenous women, Native Americans, Native Alaskans, etc., they are being targeted for DNA genome research because some of that research is looking back into the most ancient, the oldest of human beings. And so this is how they're going to trace it. So it's probably going on right now, probably will go on tomorrow. I don't know if anyone in this room is aware of this or if you want to comment on it. And I think, my last slide. Theodore Roosevelt, of all people, I just love this quote, "To educate a person in mind and not in morals is to educate a menace to society." And unfortunately, that's what we've seen. And it's true.
Now, what you have just seen is a woman that put forth factual, documented evidence about involuntary medical experience put forth on unwitting human beings. I hope you have woke up a little bit, because what she was talking about is the targeting of people of color, poor people, women, children, prisoners, indigenous people, but they are targeting all of humanity by way of fluoridation. And we're going to take a look, if you can stand anymore, we're going to take a look at a few clips about fluoride, and we're going to end this video with that. And you need to understand that we do not wrestle with flesh and blood, but spiritual wickedness in high places. And all the stuff you have heard and all the stuff you have seen, take it in. Don't get depressed, because subscribe to my channel and click the bell notification, because I'm going to show you how these poisons that they are putting in the air, in the food, and in the water that we have to take in, these poisons will not affect you. You must listen to some more of my videos that I'll be putting up in the future to show you how they will not affect you and why they will not affect you. It's very important that you do that. And if you want to get a comprehension and understanding, go to Google and just type in "Seek Truth Daily." Search it, and you will find a way and a means to get away from all this evil that scientists and doctors are putting forth upon all of humanity. There are some great, loving, truthful doctors out there. But the problem is, in today's society, they are being silenced. When they're coming out about this COVID-19, oh, I didn't mean covert. You know, covert is a secret operation, but I mean the COVID-19. There's doctors out there telling you that hydroxychloroquine with zinc will eliminate COVID-19. But when they do that, the technocrats are taking them offline. They won't let you hear what they have to say. So let's move forward and listen to some doctors that are talking about fluoride and why fluoride is not the best thing for you to put into your system. As Germany used fluoride to make the Jewish people in the gulags, which were the Jewish ghettos, docile and easier to control.
Hi, I'm Dr. Joe Nemeth. I'm a periodontist in Southfield, Michigan, and I found it a little disturbing to recently discover 2 articles published only this month about possible side effects of fluoride, particularly the fluoride in our water. This was a study done at Mount Sinai and published in Environmental International, and it talks about fluoride diminishing kidney and liver function in adolescents, and this is of concern. Now, we don't know which adolescents may be affected, if they already have somewhat compromised liver or kidney function, but nevertheless, this is something that is interesting and the first time I've read or heard about it. The second study, which may be even more pertinent, is, and this was published in August, Journal of the American Medical Association Pediatrics, and it's talking about pregnant women who drank more fluoridated water had children with 3 or 4 points lower by age 3 or 4 on their IQ. So lower IQ on children of women who drank more fluoridated water. Now, the American Dental Association says one study is not enough. Well, one study is not enough, and they need to do more. But certainly it raises concerns. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control has called fluoridation of water one of the top 10 most important advancements in public health in the 20th century. On the other hand, this is interesting, and I never knew this, but about 4 years ago, in 2015, the recommendation was lowered for the amount of fluoride in the water. It had been 0.7 to 1.2 parts per million. Now they don't want it more than 0.7 parts per million. So they're already starting to lower the amount of fluoride in the water. They may have whatever reasons they have, supposedly staining or fluorosis of the teeth, but who knows? You know, it's interesting, despite wide fluoridation, which has lowered the caries rate or the decay rate of individuals here in the United States significantly, it hasn't lowered it any more than in European countries that don't have fluoridated water but get their fluoride from dental products or local supplements, which to me is much more safe, or I think is much safer than ingesting the fluoride, which goes throughout your body and may affect your entire body. The authors of this wrote that it may be indicated to reduce fluoride in pregnant women. So, you know, there's this shadow that's being cast over fluoridated water. We don't know how important it is or how real it is, but these 2 studies, to me, are very, very, very significant.
Now, Dr. Burke, your research shows that if all of the United States had been fluoridated, that would mean about 70,000 extra deaths because of cancer per annum. Those are remarkable, impressive, and in fact rather disquieting figures. Could you shortly describe your research in this field and what results did you get from it?
Yes. The 70,000, of course, would represent 1/5 of all the cancer deaths in the United States, twice as many from breast cancer in women and twice as many as from lung cancer in man. Our studies involve comparing the deaths of all persons in the 10 largest fluoridated cities of the United States with the 10 largest non-fluoridated cities in the United States year by year. And we obtained a very remarkable curve, which you can see here perhaps. Here is the fluoridated, and here is the non-fluoridated set of 10 cities each. Here's where the fluoridation started, and before this time, both sets of cities were identical. But no sooner had fluoridation started than this curve began to go up. The deaths began to increase, so that this effect occurs very promptly within 1, 2, or 5 years.
Now this, sir, is conclusive evidence that fluor kills because of cancer.
It is one of the most conclusive bits of scientific and biological evidence that I have come across in my 50 years in the field of cancer research.
Would this then, in your opinion, be the end of fluor in water, in drinking water?
It should be the end, and in the United States, it should so be the end by federal law known as the Delaney Amendment, which says that anything found to induce cancer in man or animals cannot be legally put into the food or drink of man or animals. And so, and this is all less than 1 year old, so that it entirely changes any previous ideas of fluoridation that anyone may have had, because this is the first real indication of an important effect.
Now, in this country, of course, the state of the dental state of the Union, the way people's teeth look, is incredible indeed. Would you say that stopping fluor had other effects than increasing the dental problems in this country?
Well, I would rather look at it that it would certainly help the cancer death situation in this country, which I'm sure most people would agree is far more important than a temporary benefit to teeth in adolescent children. This, you see, amounts to public murder on a grand scale. It is a public crime, it would be, to put fluoride in the drinking water of people.
Now, the children of this cameraman and mine, sir, take fluor. Should we stop this immediately?
Well, in my opinion, if they were my children, they would not take it anymore. I can only recommend for myself, but I would suggest to you that they stop it.
Is there a difference in having fluor in drinking water or administering little fluor pills to children?
Well, of course, the little fluor pills are a much smaller proposition than drinking gallons of water per day or per week, as well as taking a bath in it and washing your automobile in it and watering your lawns. That's a very massive thing compared to brushing teeth with fluoridated toothpaste. But our work is immediately concerned with drinking water. What happens to toothpaste, I'm quite willing to let the future studies go into that in more detail.
There is, of course, you talk about murder, sir, an ethical aspect to all this, a law aspect, an aspect of people's inhumanity to people. What is your idea about how should this be implemented in our society? the ethical aspects of administering poison, as it were, to people?
Well, I think this aspect, this murder aspect, clearly indicates a very strong unethical aspect to forcing people to kill themselves.
Only by the grace of God will I be uploading a video in the near future showing you how to avoid, conquer, and combat all these toxins, air, water, and food that this evil of this world is causing you to take within your human system. Not just you, but your mother and father and your children. All are under this evil umbrella of consumption, food, air, and water. But there is a way and there is a power that will cause all of that poison to dissipate and have no effect on your system. Seek the truth daily. The truth will find you seeking. May the grace of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, be with you all.